Welcome everybody to our first workshop of our series on the social analysis of penality across boundaries. Thank you very much for coming this morning, early afternoon, depending on where you are. It's great to have with us Professor Thomas Ugelvik from the University of Oslo in Norway. Thomas has been a professor for many years in the University of Oslo and has been working in the field of penology, doing different kind of research projects. He has been also one of the founding editors of the journal Incarceration, that I am sure that many of you know, and has produced very interesting stuff around both prison and re-entry. And today he will present a new paper around the kindness of strangers, mutual trust relationships, and the co-production desistance. As always, Tom will speak for something like half an hour, and then we will have a space for comments and questions. Again, Thomas, many thanks for being with us. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Maximo. I should thank Richard as well, I guess. I don't know if he's here. He had big things happening in his life earlier this morning when he became grandfather for the first time. I think I'm allowed to say that, right? Many thanks for the opportunity to present the paper. It is the second paper coming out of what I've called the Oslo Re-Entry Study, the ORES project for short, which is a longitudinal interview-based study of desistance and post-release reintegration in Norway. The first ORES paper was published by the British Journal of Criminology in 2021. That paper is about the role interpersonal trust between prisoners and prison officers and other members of staff may play in desistance processes. The paper I'll present today is very much a companion piece, in the sense that it asks many of the same questions, but instead of relationships between prisoners and staff, it looks at relationships between former prisoners and members of civil society, just regular people that they meet post-release. As a matter of necessity, prisoners mainly have to interact with other prisoners. Release from prison most often results in a radical widening of the social horizon, including interaction with larger numbers and different kinds of people. In practice, however, many aspiring desisters from the outset feel estranged and disconnected from regular people leading normal lives, the kind of lives to which they may now aspire. And I should, of course, clarify before I move on that I use these concepts, regular people and normal lives, as emic terms. The ORES project participants often use such terms to describe the change process they are going through and the goals they hope to accomplish. Fundamentally, they all seem to agree that normal lives are not compatible with repeat criminal justice involvement. They also often highlight aspects such as having a steady job, settling into a sensible circadian rhythm, and owning a nice home where they can live a quiet family life. Exactly what they have in mind when they talk about regular people leading normal lives is not always clear, however, and must sometimes be inferred from the conversational context. An abundance of research exists on how former prisoners are met by their communities upon release and how they are successfully integrated back into civil society or not. Many studies have focused on the experience of stigma and exclusion, building on insights from existential sociology and dramatic identity theory. In this paper, I would like to take a look instead on at how what role the concept of trust may play in these processes. I will look at how everyday informal mutual trust relationships between former offenders who aim to make significant life changes and the new people they encounter along the way may impact their desistance journeys. Maruna and Farrell have described two distinguishable phases of desistance. Primary desistance refers to any crime-free gap in the course of a criminal career, while secondary desistance happens when this change in behavior is accompanied by the adoption of a related non-offending identity. More recently, McNeill has added a third phase to the model. Tertiary desistance refers to shifts in the sister's sense of belonging to a moral and political community. This sense of belonging may have different facets and come about in different ways for different people, but research has shown that recognition by others of one's willingness and ability to change can strengthen desistance processes. I argue in this paper that to play a relevant role in this process, these others must be willing to explicitly or tacitly to acknowledge and recognize the changes that have been made. Such recognition can be demonstrated in practice in different ways, whether in the form of verbal acknowledgement or the bestowal of second chances. And different kinds of recognition will probably be meaningful to different people. The aim in the following is to look at the significance of being the object of trust and the experience of someone acting towards us in a trusting way, even when we have shown ourselves to be untrustworthy in the past. Following Farrell et al., one might then say that this study is part of the strand of research that aims to develop an understanding of the, and I quote, the precise mechanisms through which the individual experiences those things that motivate and promote change. The study can also be seen as an example of what Maruna has called the phenomenology of desistance, which focuses on the experiential aspects that connect desistance processes to the development of a desister identity. And I'll move on to a bit of theoretical framing now. There is strong consensus among researchers that desistance should be seen as an ongoing process rather than something that happens once and for all at a specific moment. Previous research has shown how the ongoing creation of a new identity in line with desistance is a vital part of this process. And while this may sound relatively straightforward, as a theoretical concept, identity is notoriously complex and hard to pin down. Its relationship to related concepts such as self or self-image and self-concept is also frequently opaque. In this paper, my analysis is informed by two partly overlapping theoretical positions. First, I'm inspired by key insights taken from existential sociology, where the goal is to understand how we define ourselves, how we change our definitions, what makes us change these definitions, how much we can do or can change, how much we are anchored down by our bodies and by our sense of social position, all of the questions that pertain to the total sense of that elusive thing we call the self, to quote Fontana. From an existentialist perspective, the self can be described as becoming, situational, reflexive, and free. Becoming because it is never final, but always unfolding, changing, and developing in response to social stimuli. Situational because this process of becoming is dependent on and tied into the specific historical, sociocultural, biological, and material contexts people find themselves in, what is often referred to as facticity. Reflexive because human beings are self-aware and may actively relate and respond to these contexts. And finally, free because human beings are never fully determined by the circumstances shaping their lives, rather than seeing the self as dependent on or a passive result of facticity. Existential sociology reconceptualizes the self as an active, if not independent, agent that is constantly engaged in reinvention processes, with a term that is conceptually very closely linked to facticity, transcendence. Put differently, we are self-making beings who become what and who we are on the basis of the situated and reflexive choices we make at the intersection between facticity and transcendence. And in the following, I use the term identity change as a shorthand reference to this continuous negotiation process. Second, and dovetailing nicely with insights from existential sociology, dramatic identity theory highlights along the lines of Goffman's influential analysis of the presentation of self in everyday life, the idea that ourselves is continuously recreated vis-a-vis and with the help of different audiences. From this perspective, the social judgment of others is essential to the formation of our identities. This, of course, is a topic Goffman also explored in his groundbreaking work on stigma. As social animals, we seek to represent ourselves on various social stages according to the values and norms that are relevant on that stage. From this perspective, whenever human beings interact, we act as each other's supporting cast members and thus constantly contribute to each other's identity construction processes. Dramatic identity theory highlights how experiences of identification with others, as well as contrasting constitutive others, are both necessary parts of our mutual identity construction process. And this is where I probably should describe my research methods just a little bit. I'm going to do this briefly because I want to get to the data and the analysis. Like I said, this paper is the second output from a longitudinal qualitative research project where I follow 14 male participants through the prison release process and back into society. The participants are all repeat offenders, and most have spent years in prison on several convictions. Participants were first interviewed between 1 year prior to release and 1 year post-release. The semi-structured interviews focused on how participants have come to terms with the release process, how they plan to deploy their various resources, what challenges to sustained assistance they foresaw, and how they plan to overcome those challenges. The participants were then subsequently re-interviewed 6 months to a year after the first interviews, and additional follow-up interviews are planned at various intervals. Because the aim is to study which resources may strengthen desistance processes, promising cases have been purposefully recruited with the help of the Norwegian Correctional Services. With one exception, participants were recommended by probation and prison officers as people they believed to be in the process of making significant life changes. In the case of the one exception, the participant self-nominated after hearing about the study through his network. The rationale behind this strategy is that a study of the importance of various resources for desistance processes requires participants with access to such resources in order to work. Unlike the average Norwegian prisoners, then, the ORS participants are repeat offenders who have expressed a clear and believable motivation to change their lives, and who enjoy the benefit of a substantial reservoir of individual, network, and structural resources. The idea is that what we learn from analyzing these cases and their individual successes and failures can be put to use to help both the minority of prisoners who, like the ORS participants, have a wide range of different resources available, and the majority who are released from prison into situations characterized by a larger degree of deprivation and increased marginality. And finally, I can move on to the specific cases. I'll start with Bård, who was in his late 20s when we first met. He had been sentenced for relatively minor, mainly cannabis-related drug offenses a number of times in the past. But at the time of our first interview, he had just been released after serving about a year in prison for a violent offense. He claimed to be innocent and that he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. Prior to this conviction, he had worked for several NGOs as a volunteer, but also as a paid employee. And he was also an active member of a political party and had been pursuing a promising career in politics. During his sentence, he had expected to be able to return to this work in the future, but after release, he soon realized that the violent offense conviction had changed everything. My case went all the way to the bloody top, he told me. Suddenly, the people at the top of this international NGO, the Nordic office, the bosses sat there discussing my case. And it was like, no, we can't use him. We know that he probably didn't do anything. We do trust him, but he's just too big of a liability. Disillusioned, Bård felt that his days as an employee in large international NGOs, as well as his political career, were now over. And this was a very heavy blow to Bård, since it meant that his preferred career path was close to him. It did not really fare for the future. He had recently received several job offers, so money would not really be a problem, he thought, but it seemed like he would have to make do with a job that might challenge both his political values and his identity. Now, Bård's case shows that all is not bright futures and open doors in the ORIS project data. Frustrated plans and closed career paths do exist. It is clear, however, that Bård's story is an exception in the sense that the majority of the participants mainly told me stories about trust and second chances. Arne, for instance, was in his late 50s at the time of our first interview. By his own account, he had been seen as the black sheep of his family ever since he was a young man, and he had experienced firsthand how repeated breaches of trust could lead to the breakdown of relationships. After having promised to his family on multiple occasions that he would never again go back to prison, at the time of our first conversation, he was undergoing post-sentence probation supervision after having served a 13-year prison sentence for a drug offense. In light of his past, he understood why several members of his family felt the need to keep their distance and that they wanted to wait and see whether he would actually make significant changes this time. They did socialize on occasion, but he felt that they clearly did not trust him, at least not yet. Given the fragile relationships with his family, his relationship with his employer was all the more important to him. He had served the last leg of his 13-year sentence in a low-security prison. After getting a job as a middle manager in a company that provides cleaning services, he was allowed to leave the prison during the day to go to work. He enjoyed the work and the freedom of moving around the city between clients at his own accord. After some time, however, he failed a routine drugs test and was promptly recalled to a high-security prison. In the interview, he insisted that he had not been taking any drugs at the time and that the positive test happened because someone he used to be close to had spiked his coffee with drugs on purpose to sabotage his progress. Being recalled to a high-security prison was a massive blow to Arne. At the time, he saw everything he had worked for over the past few years just crumble into dust, including the job he liked so much. Instead, to Arne's surprise, his employer told him that his job would be waiting for him when he got out. She was more or less the only one I talked to on the phone that entire time, he told me. And she backed me, the employer, the manager. She backed me all the way. You'll be back at work soon, she said. You'll be back in your office. The job will still be there waiting for you when you get out. If she hadn't been there for me, to be honest, I would have relapsed, gone back to my old life, even though this new life is much better. It's amazing. But how would I have managed without a job to go to when I got out? I wouldn't have had anything. I would have had to find a bedsit somewhere. Would have just sat there by myself, nothing to do, and would have had to start making new friends, a new network from scratch, all by myself. To Arne, the fact that failing a drug test and being recalled to high security had not led to a loss of trust felt particularly meaningful. When the manager decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, Arne saw it as confirmation that at least one person had acknowledged the changes he had made to his life. David was in his late 30s at the time of the first interview. He had recently been released from prison early after serving 6 out of the 9 years he had been sentenced to for multiple violent offenses. He was undergoing regular probation supervision. He worked full-time on a permanent contract at a municipal waste management facility. He explicitly described being offered this job as a life-changing moment. It is pure gold, he said. It's like I say, the way they've welcomed me, no judgment. You're one of the guys right away. It's almost like they've become my family. And it's like, if you want, you can even go have a chat with the boss. She'll take the time and talk and show that she cares. You don't get that feeling, the feeling that she doesn't have the time, you know? So they know me, my entire background, and they still include me. They still want me there, and they do care. One of the managers told me before the Christmas holiday, he said, okay, just call me whenever if you have any negative thoughts. Just let me know and we'll meet up and do something. I hope I never lose this job. That's what I mean when I say that I have too much to lose now. If I screw this up, I won't get something like this ever again. I think the social control element is very clear in David's description of his relationship with the co-workers and managers at the waste management facility, because he desperately did not want to lose this job. But something else is also going on in the data excerpt. Yes, he felt like he had more to lose now, but one can also sense a newfound sense of pride and community flowing from the fact that his co-workers and managers knew about his past, but had decided to trust and include him anyway. They saw his past as just that, his past, and not his present. And the trusting relationships he was now a part of were indicative of the fact that they saw the changes he had made as real. Endre was in his 30s when I first interviewed him in a low security prison. 10 months later, we met up again for a second interview after he had been transferred to a low security transition prison. In the meantime, Endre had started working as a carpenter at a building company. He really enjoyed the work, both the fact that he lived now what he called a normal life, in the sense that he had to get up in the morning, and that he had a clear purpose. He felt that honesty had been key. His whole situation rested on the fact that he had chosen to be honest about his past. I've been more or less pretty open and honest about the fact that I'm in prison, he said, and that I have a long sentence and that kind of thing. But I'm also clear about being super motivated and that I want to start a new and better life. And they think it's great, and they wished me luck and supported me, all of them. Your colleagues, you mean, I ask? Yes. I guess they knew all along. Yes, the bosses knew, but not the guys. So they welcomed me with open arms the first few days, and this one boss said to me that they hadn't told the other employees anything and that it was up to me what I wanted them to know. I think that was very good, so I started quietly and one by one to tell people not how long I've been inside, but that I'm close to the end of a prison sentence, that I have 18 months to go, a bit of violence and a bit of drugs. That's what I've told people. So what's their reaction, I asked? Oh, you know, they laugh a bit and then they tell me about family members or friends who've spent time in prison. Several of them have said that it's just luck that they haven't spent time in prison themselves. They don't know anything about prison. Opinions are divided, I guess. Some of them are very curious and ask me a bunch of questions. Others just smile and shake their heads, almost as if it's a bit funny. So no, not a problem at all, and it feels good to be honest. At the beginning, Endre was unsure of how his co-workers would react to hearing the truth about his past. Because the managers had left it up to him to decide who and what to tell, he was able to carefully choose the time and place for these conversations. Revealing details about his past still felt like a precarious moment, and Endre was not certain how things would play out. He had taken a chance and trusted his co-workers with information about his past, and they in turn had shown him that they now trusted him despite his past, thus strengthening their relationship as a result. The final case I have time to go into today is Jens, who was in his early 40s at the time of our first interview. He had previously served multiple shorter sentences for violent offenses. When we first met, he was approaching the end of a very long sentence for murder. Jens was understandably anxious about what the future might have in store for him. At the time, he had serious doubts about whether he would ever be able to secure a job after release. So he told me, when I go out the prison gates for the last time, in a way, I'll be resentenced again and again, no matter what people say. There will always be people out there who will judge me for what I've done. Even if I served my sentence and I made up for my past mistakes in that sense, I'll still be sentenced again and again by people I meet. So it might be difficult for me to find a job, just a regular job with a living wage. Jens's case was a very high-profile one, as murder cases in Norway often are. He knew that details about what he had done would never be more than a Google search away, and he felt sure that his past would go on to haunt him for the rest of his life. The way he saw it, his past had hardened into a solid fact, part of the facticity he would just have to accept and find a way to live with. When we met up almost 18 months later, things had changed for the better. He was still in prison, but he was allowed day leave to go to work as a landscaper. I was actually offered 2 jobs, he told me, but I'd have to travel quite far, which was a bit of a worry. But then this guy who works in the prison came up to me and said that he'd introduced me to his mate who runs a landscaping company who might want to hire me, and it's much closer to the prison, so I wouldn't have to travel. So we went over and he introduced me, and 15 minutes later I had a job. They knew each other, but he didn't know about my past at all. So I told him, before you hire me, I think you should Google my name and see what you find. I think it's much better that way. Then I won't have to sit there and tell the whole story. So he went on Google right then and there, and he just sat there all quiet for like 10 minutes. I just sipped my coffee and waited for him to finish. And then he lit a cigarette and looked at me and said, okay, we better draw up a contract for you. And that was that. It was a bit strange to meet new people and all that. I was a bit withdrawn in the beginning, but I am who I am. I tell people who I am and what I've done. I have no problem with that. I've been honest since the beginning. You mean co-workers, people you meet at work? I asked him. Yes, it's better to tell it straight, you know. I don't want them to find out from someone else. I learned that years ago. You connect with people, create friendships with people who haven't been part of that kind of criminal scene. Just regular people collecting their wages. They don't have that mentality. I've missed being around regular people. For Jens, as for David above or earlier, the workplace had become a place to connect with regular people to the extent that his new network now felt like friends as much as co-workers. Jens's case shows that, again, people may be willing to show someone trust, despite even very serious offenses, if they are open about past transgressions. What had looked to be a solid and unchanging fact a year and a half earlier, that he would never be able to escape his past, turned out to be much more pliable. I think these cases show that from the perspective of tertiary desistance, the experience of being trusted can potentially be very important. Being seen as trustworthy in general is, of course, a practical advantage if one's aim is to lead a law-abiding life. Life simply runs more smoothly when people trust us. But in addition to the practical aspects, certain emotional and identity-related aspects may be equally important. An internalized desistance narrative is thought to play an important psychological function for desistance processes. The interview quotes I've shown you show how employers and co-workers and other members of civil society may work with former offenders, co-producing new law-abiding identities. The phenomenon of interpersonal trust may play an important part of this reimagination process. Current and former prisoners are often very much aware of the fact that many people see them as untrustworthy. For individual desisters, then being seen as trustworthy by specific individuals may give them cause to believe not only that they are seen as changed in the eyes of other people, but also that trustworthiness may continue and develop in the future, possibly unlocking new future selves and new paths towards continued change. So far, I've concentrated very much on the experiences of the individual desisters and the possible impact interpersonal trust may have on identity change processes. At the end of the paper, I zoom out briefly and discuss some of the structural and sociocultural factors that I think are important for our understanding of the specific cases. One important structural precondition, I think, is that unlike the situation in many other countries, Norwegian employers do not, as a rule, have access to the criminal records of potential employees. This kind of information is not publicly available, and only a few specific kinds of employers, such as schools, kindergartens, etc., may request access. And even in these cases, employers will be given information about a few select offense categories only, such as violent and sex offenses. They will not get a full transcript of the criminal record. And I believe that the data suggests that the fact that the study participants in most of these cases were able to decide whether and how to disclose this information themselves should be seen as a success factor. The data also suggests that Norway seems, I think, to have a latent reservoir of trust that current and former prisoners can draw from under some circumstances. Sakslin and Skarpenes examined the moral values of the highly educated Norwegian middle class and found two recurring figures when people were asked whom they were fascinated by, looked up to, or admired: the Good Samaritan and the socially responsible citizen. The former is a cultural trope typified by the altruistic person who cares about their neighbors and is willing to help those who are less fortunate. The latter is epitomized by the person who gives time and resources towards the goal of creating stronger and more well-connected communities. Granted, there may always be a certain distance between these lofty ideals and actual actions and life choices, but Sakslin and Skarpenes' study shows how important what they call Christian humanistic values still are for the Norwegian middle class. The extent to which these values are shared by members of Norwegian society more broadly is a question for future research. But at the very least, this study, I think, indicates the existence of what we may call a cultural moral repertoire, whereby people are seen as changeable, and where even the worst among us have potential. These collective values can be seen as potentially desistance conducive in the sense that they can support people who want to take a risk and trust someone who is trying to turn over a new leaf. At the same time, in such a cultural setting, giving someone a second chance will likely allow the giver the opportunity to see themselves as a provider of second chances, in other words, a good Samaritan. Finally, it is important to acknowledge that there are quite obvious limits to the inclusionary values described in my paper. Society clearly sees some former offenders as much more employable than others. Norwegian research suggests that there are important limits to the willingness to include some specific subgroups of former offenders. The ORES project data, for example, has no convicted sex offenders. I therefore have no data to back it up, but in my view, the results would have been very different had the participants all been convicted sex offenders. In conclusion, from the perspective of the individual desister, being seen as someone who has successfully turned over a new leaf may feel like a strong invitation to continue in the direction of further transcendence and strengthened integration into a normal, whatever that means, lifestyle. From the perspective of society, this situation is perhaps better conceived of as a result of a form of social capital. I believe that the notion of interpersonal trust is particularly interesting from this perspective because it can be seen as a cultural, social, and relational phenomenon that may have important consequences at the level of the individual. The interpersonal trust described in this article, I believe, is a prime example of this interplay where social and individual factors come together to mutually strengthen desistance mechanisms or processes, and in the process turning strangers into friends, assumed or self-ascribed stigma into inclusion, and repeat offenders into ex-offenders. Thank you.